John Ashworth, by his integrity, attention to business, and indomitable perseverance, ultimately succeeded in establishing a good business and forming a respectable connection. He was the author of several anonymous productions, one of which was a dialogue published in 1843 entitled Women's Lodges, A Bitter Talk About 'em, between Mary and Nancy, in the Lancashire dialect. There was an old grey-haired Christian man named Richard who went to Bagslate Chapel, where John Ashworth had gone as a boy and where he still had his connections. Richard's 18-year-old daughter Ellen died, followed by his wife and all but one of his 12 children, until only one daughter called Alice was left. Old Richard was often seen leaning on his staff, and sometimes on the arm of his dutiful daughter, who was born again of the Spirit when she was about 17. Richard and Alice moved to a small cottage near Blackpitt's Mill, where Alice worked. This may have been at Moss Row, which has now been replaced by some sheltered housing down Clapgate Road in Norden. Blackpitt's Mill, where Alice worked as a powerloom weaver, stood on the banks of a stream in Norden. The old mill chimney still stands at the end of Blackpitt's Road. Mr. Ashworth wrote, "As you leave the valley in which the chapel stands, travelling due west, at Shepherd's Mill you cross a brook gathering from the mountain rills, and as it meanders down the vale, supplying the woollen bleach works and cotton mills, it ultimately joins Bamford Brook and finally empties itself into the River Roach." One winter's evening, old Richard, as usual, was preparing the meal for Alice on her return. He had put fresh coals on the fire and poured hot water into the teapot. On a small round table covered with a white cloth stood the cups and bread and butter. The candle was burning on the mantelpiece. That night the little cottage bore the aspect of peace and cheerfulness. "I like," said the old man, "to have everything as comfortable as I can for my Alice when she comes from her work." The mill had stopped, and the hands were returning home in groups. The night being dark, care was required in passing between the reservoir and the brook. Alice, hastening to get home, took a wrong step. One wild scream, a plunge, another wild smothering scream, and the deep dark waters rolled over the body of poor Alice. Lights and ropes and drags and every available means to save her were instantly brought to bear, and while the flickering torches borne by many hands cast their reflecting light on the deep waves, groups of weeping friends stood round the sad scene, and when at last the body was found and laid on the bank, it was evident to all that her soul had fled. That dark night Alice was drowned. The inquest into Alice's death took place at the Brown Cow pub in Bagslate on the 23rd of December 1843. An article in the Manchester Times the following week said, "On Saturday an inquest was held before Ferrand Dearden, coroner, at the house of Mr. John Taylor, Brown Cow, Bagslate, on the body of a young woman named Alice Lord, aged 20 years, who was employed at the Blackpitt's cotton mill as a powerloom weaver. The deceased was found drowned in the mill dam of Mr. Buckley on the 22nd. Verdict, found drowned." After Alice's death, her father, old Richard, lived at a place called The Springs at Pitfield, with a cotton weaver named William Folds and his family. Even though Richard's wife and his children had all died, John Ashworth said, "These multiplied sorrows gradually tended to enrich and mature Richard's piety. His mind was stayed on God, and that peace which the world can neither give nor take away was his increasing inheritance." William Folds said, "Richard lived with me a long time and died at my house at a place called Springs near Bagslate and Bamford." Mr. Folds frequently called at John Ashworth's house for the money he allowed Richard weekly, so that he wouldn't have to go into the workhouse. Mr. Ashworth later published one of his strange tales about old Richard's story, which he entitled The Dark Night. In 1845, Mr. Ashworth contributed some articles to a Rochdale publication called The Sabbath School Friend. In the same year he opened a school at Mount Pleasant, the area in which the jail or prison known as Rochdale Lockup stood. The purpose of this school was to care for and to educate the poor neglected children running about the streets, and the opening of it may be considered Mr. Ashworth's first work amongst the outcasts and destitute. In 1848, an event took place which brought distress and ruin into hundreds of families, the collapse of the Rochdale Savings Bank, by which 2,965 depositors sustained a loss of £38,287. Amongst them were widows, servants, miners, labourers, sick clubs and trust accounts. Mr. Ashworth, along with some other gentlemen, did all he could, but in vain, to obtain some compensation from the government for those who had suffered from the disaster. John Ashworth made fortnightly visits to see his ageing parents at his former home at Simpson Clough near Bamford. One night he found his father praying in the same woods in which he himself had prayed as a boy one dark night of sorrow, that his father might not get drunk any more. He didn't disturb his father, but ran home with joy to tell his mother, who, because her husband had become a changed man, smiled and through her tears said, "Our prayers are heard at last, and my sun is now setting in a clear sky." John Ashworth's father died on the 5th of April 1849 at the age of 75. He was buried at Bamford Chapel. In 1849 John Ashworth married his second wife, Hannah Wood, a step for which he felt truly thankful. Hannah was the daughter of the late Joseph Wood, a flour dealer who lived on Yorkshire Street in Rochdale. One day a committee called the Sunday School Union came together to discuss how they might dissuade another group of gentlemen from planning an event known as the Rochdale Races. The Rochdale Races consisted of what Mr. Ashworth describes as very deplorable scenes, gambling, drinking and general pandemonium. These events were frequented by characters like Nathaniel or Niff Kershaw and Jane Clough from Cuckgate and Bagslate. In his narrative The Contest, John Ashworth tells how a representative of the committee attended a planning meeting for the Rochdale Races, which was being held in a large chamber of the Woolpack Inn on Drake Street. The Woolpack was situated near the top of Drake Street and is now used as an employment links centre. Mr. Ashworth gave God the credit for the committee's success when the Rochdale Races stopped for good the following year. The final meeting took place on the 25th of July 1850. Mr. Ashworth's daughter Mary Jane was converted when she was about 7 years old. By 1851 the Ashworth family were living at number 56 Drake Street and had a house servant. John and Hannah Ashworth were both now in their late 30s, and Mr. Ashworth continued to work as a painter. His son Felix was a letterpress printer, while Harold and Mary Jane went to school. 56 Drake Street was located where Champness Hall is now. Champness Hall opened in 1925. John Ashworth's mother, Alice, left the family home at Simpson Clough following the death of her husband and went to live in Haywood with one of her daughters and her family. Mr. Ashworth says he had a love of rural walks and country scenes, which often led him to the neighbouring hills and dales. In his narrative Old Abe, he describes how he was out walking amongst the purple heath and sheep tracks of Ruley Moor and Hungry Hill, when he saw the roof of a house below. After his walk he says he felt hungry for a good dinner, referring to Hungry Hill as a right-named hill. So he went down to the house, hoping it might be the home of some hospitable person. He passed through a stone stile and entered the open farmyard, realising he was at Bankhouse Farm. Bankhouse Farmhouse was built in 1694. Mr. Ashworth wrote, "As you ascend from the Vale of Rochdale on the western side, skirting the hamlet of Spotland, near the moorlands, the valley opening to the right reveals the tops of Longridge and Knowle Hill. On the rising ground near the summit of Longridge stood a few whitewashed cottages and a farm called Bankhouse. There was a society at Bankhouse visited by preachers at Bury, and John Wesley, having first mentioned Rochdale in his journal on the 18th of October 1749, visited Bankhouse near Rochdale on the 3rd of April 1752. At Bankhouse Farm the old-fashioned broad oak stairs once served as a pulpit for Mr. Wesley, and in a large field behind, George Whitfield preached to a crowd gathered from hill and dale, with such mighty power that the echo reverberated from the rocks on the opposite side of the valley. In John Ashworth's day, Bankhouse Farm had become the home of Abraham and Anne Lord, an aged couple who attended Bagslate Chapel. Abraham Lord, a farmer, was known as Old Abe, and was a giant of a man, giant in bone and stature. Many years previously, after his wife Anne had been saved by God, Abe went to Union Street Chapel one evening where his soul was stirred because of the preaching. During the singing of one hymn he was wrought to such a pitch of agony that he called out, "Murder, murder," not knowing what he said. Afterwards he set off home. It was a stormy winter evening. The snow was piled up in large drifts and blocking up the road in many places. Abe went on and began to ascend a by-lane behind Norden. Then, falling on his knees with his face against a wall of snow, he began to cry for mercy. Long he knelt, and long he cried until his hot breath melted a hole in the drifted snow. God heard his cry, saw his sorrow for sin, and spoke peace to his soul. Up he sprang and lifted both hands, clapped them over his head, and shouted for joy. When he got home, he shouted, "Lass, lass, I'm saved, I'm saved! God has saved my soul in a snowdrift. Glory, glory!" This John Ashworth describes as the ecstasies of the new birth. One of Abe's besetments was hunting. After his conversion, he went back to it once, but it made him miserable. Mr. Bogey, the minister of Rochdale, told him to pray for more strength to resist the temptation, and that God would help him, and after that he hunted no more. When he was saved, Abe said he shouted louder than when he went hunting, for he said he had far more need to shout the praises of Jesus Christ than to shout after hunting dogs. Abe could not say his ABC, but he got a little spelling book and looked for someone to teach him to read. After his conversion, Abe joined the church at Bagslate. When he was a boy at Bagslate Sunday School, John Ashworth remembered seeing old Abe sitting with his face towards the pulpit, his mouth and ears open to catch the words. He could sing with uncommon power and led the singing with a vengeance. He wasn't the leading singer, but apparently all had to go at his speed, and as he sang aloud for joy, his voice sounded above all instruments. Mr. Ashworth wrote, "Many said that Abraham's religion was all noise and sound, but I thought he had more religion than all the people in the chapel." Abe said, "I'm the most humble, and think of God best when me stomach's empty, and I think sometime God lets it be empty to keep me reet, till I'm better rooted and grounded." He also said, "When thou brings thy troubles to Jesus, thou may go straight to him, and he will make thee welcome." On the day John Ashworth was walking near Bankhouse, Mr. and Mrs. Lord gave him some bread and butter, and the three believers ended up praising God together in loud voice, whilst facing the valley that stretched out to Tandle Hills and the Yorkshire boundaries. Mr. Ashworth described it as a moment of deep, unspeakable bliss, a bliss which none but Christians know.